£70. That is the kind of parking penalty you could now face simply for driving into the wrong road at the wrong time. And if you think parking rules are still the same as they were a year ago, you could be in for a very unpleasant surprise. New enforcement powers are arriving, camera enforcement is expanding, and one of the biggest changes affects pavement parking across England. But there is another part of this story that could save you money rather than cost you money. And most drivers have misunderstood exactly what is changing. The important thing is that not every headline about new parking laws means a brand new fine starts tomorrow. Some changes are already being enforced locally. Some powers have now become law but still require implementation. And some proposed private parking protections are not yet in force. So in this video, I'm going to separate what is actually happening from the claims spreading online, because knowing the difference could be the thing that stops you paying a fine you never needed to pay. The big development comes from the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act, which received royal assent in April 2026. It gives more local transport authorities powers to enforce dangerous pavement parking, including through penalty charge notices. The government has specifically said this is intended to allow local authorities outside London to tackle pavement parking where it causes problems. And that matters because the old assumption, I've parked two wheels on the pavement for years and nobody has ever bothered me, is no longer something you should rely on. If you regularly park partly or completely on the pavement, especially on narrow residential streets, you need to start checking what your local authority is doing. The government's January 2026 announcement made clear that secondary legislation is being introduced to enable councils to enforce unnecessary obstruction of pavements, while longer-term local powers will allow restrictions to be introduced according to local circumstances. And there is a very important detail here. This is not simply a case of the entire country suddenly waking up one morning with one identical nationwide pavement parking ban. The system is being devolved, meaning the exact restrictions and enforcement arrangements can depend on the local transport authority and the restrictions actually introduced in your area. So if you are a pensioner, a homeowner, or simply someone who parks outside your house every evening, don't assume that because your neighbor has always parked on the pavement, you are automatically protected. Check your local council's parking and traffic notices, particularly if new signs or restrictions have appeared. And now we get to the part that could actually work in your favor. Private parking rules are changing, but be extremely careful with anyone telling you that a new nationwide £50 cap and mandatory 10-minute grace period are already fully enforced everywhere. They are not. The government's own 2025 consultation shows that the new government code of practice was still being developed while the existing industry code had its own transition timetable through December 2026. That distinction is crucial. There has been a long-running government plan for stronger regulation of private parking, including clearer signage, grace periods, limits on charges, and a stronger appeals framework. The earlier government code proposed a 10-minute grace period and different parking charge caps, but that version was withdrawn. The government consulted again in 2025 on a new code. So if a private parking company sends you a charge today, don't simply assume that the new £50 law automatically makes the ticket invalid. Instead, look at the actual notice. Is it a council penalty charge notice? Is it a private parking charge? Which company issued it? What road or car park were you in? What signs were displayed? And what exact rule are they alleging you broke? That is your first defense. And there is another important protection people often misunderstand: grace periods. Government material on the proposed private parking code has repeatedly supported a 10-minute grace period at the end of a permitted parking period. and the withdrawn government code contained detailed provisions for consideration and grace periods. But the current government consultation makes clear that the final government code was still being prepared. So if somebody tells you, you were 11 minutes late, therefore the new law guarantees you win, don't take that statement at face value. Check which rules apply to that particular car park and operator. The same applies to signage. Clear signs matter enormously in private parking disputes. The government has proposed requirements around signs being clear and understandable, and the earlier code specifically recognized that drivers need an opportunity to understand the terms before entering into the parking arrangement. That means your first action after receiving a private parking charge should not necessarily be reaching for your bank card. Take photographs. Photograph the entrance. Photograph the signs. Photograph the bay markings. Photograph the machine. Photograph anything that blocks or obscures the terms. Keep the payment receipt if you have one. Write down the time you arrived and the time you left. Because weeks later, when you're trying to challenge the charge, your memory may be worth far less than a photograph taken on the day. And now let's talk about cameras, because this is where the biggest practical change is already happening. Automatic number plate recognition, or ANPR, is increasingly being used to enforce restrictions, where councils have the appropriate powers. School streets are one of the clearest examples. A school street is an area where motor traffic is restricted during specific times, usually around school drop-off and collection. Councils can use cameras to identify vehicles entering during those restricted periods, and penalty charge notices can be issued to non-exempt vehicles. This is not theoretical. In 2026, councils have been introducing and expanding camera enforcement at individual school street schemes. For example, Enfield began ANPR enforcement at Furs Farm School Street from 29th June 2026, with restrictions operating during specified morning and afternoon periods during term time. Leeds also introduced camera enforcement at 2 existing school streets in March 2026. And this is exactly why you cannot rely on the old habit of thinking there wasn't a traffic warden there, so I'm fine. A camera doesn't need to stand beside your car. It can record the vehicle entering a restricted zone, and the registered keeper can receive the penalty notice afterwards. Imagine Brian, who has driven the same route to collect his grandson for years. One afternoon, he takes the usual shortcut, sees no police officer, and keeps going. What Brian doesn't realize is that the council has introduced camera enforcement at the school street, and the restriction operates during the exact time he normally drives through. There is no argument that he didn't see anyone. The restriction is based on the signs and the operating hours. That is why the most valuable habit you can develop in 2026 is checking the signs on routes you use repeatedly, rather than assuming the road works exactly as it did last year. And there is another trap here: exemptions. Some school street schemes have specific exemptions for residents, blue badge holders, certain carers, emergency services, or other qualifying vehicles. But an exemption is not necessarily automatic. Some councils require you to register or apply for a permit before enforcement begins. Enfield, for example, states that certain exemptions must be applied for before enforcement starts. So if you live inside or regularly travel through a school street, don't wait until the first penalty arrives. Check the council's own school street page now. Find out the operating hours. Find out whether your vehicle is exempt. And most importantly, find out whether you need to register that exemption. Because I qualify for an exemption and my vehicle is already registered as exempt can be 2 completely different things. And just when you think the camera issue is only about schools, moving traffic enforcement is spreading into other types of restrictions as well. Councils with the relevant powers can use cameras for certain contraventions, And official guidance already provides for camera enforcement in specified circumstances. So the era of parking enforcement being something you only notice when a person puts a ticket underneath your windscreen wiper is disappearing. More and more enforcement can happen without anyone standing next to your vehicle. And that brings us to the next issue dropped, curbs. Because this is one of those situations where drivers often say, but I wasn't actually blocking the driveway. That may not be enough. Parking around dropped curbs and vehicle crossings can create obstruction problems, and councils and police already have enforcement powers in different circumstances. The exact offense and enforcement route depends on the location and circumstances. So again, don't assume that a familiar parking habit is automatically safe simply because nobody challenged you before. If you regularly park across a dropped curb, near a pedestrian crossing point, or over a vehicle access point, treat it as a warning sign and check the local restrictions rather than waiting for a PCN. And there's one more thing you should remember before we move on. A parking ticket is not automatically correct simply because it came from a council or because it arrived through the post. But it is also not automatically fake or illegal simply because you disagree with it. The correct response is evidence. What restriction applied? What sign was present? What time did it operate? What vehicle was recorded? What evidence does the authority have? And what appeal process is printed on the notice? That is how you protect yourself. Because the biggest mistake drivers can make in 2026 isn't simply parking somewhere they shouldn't. It is receiving a notice, panicking, paying immediately, and only afterwards discovering that they should have checked the evidence first. And we're not finished yet. Because the next part of this story brings together the issue of private parking charges, camera enforcement, electric vehicle bays, idling restrictions, and the one simple routine that can save you from making the same expensive mistake over and over again. So here's where this leaves you. The parking system in Britain in 2026 is becoming much more dependent on signs, cameras, local restrictions, and evidence. And that means the old habit of relying on what you've always done is becoming increasingly risky. Let's start with private parking, because this is where some of the biggest online claims are currently causing confusion. You may have heard that private parking charges have been reduced to £50, that 10-minute grace periods are now mandatory everywhere, and that a new national appeals service has completely replaced the existing system. Be careful. The government's own documents show that the new statutory code of practice was still being developed, while the existing industry code was already operating and moving through its own implementation period. The government's 2025 consultation specifically discussed proposed caps ranging from £50 to £100 outside London and higher amounts in London, rather than confirming that a universal £50 legal cap had already taken effect. That means you should not ignore a private parking charge simply because somebody on social media says the new law makes it illegal. Check the actual rules governing the charge. And if you think the charge is wrong, use the appeal route identified on the notice. This is particularly important because private parking is different from council parking. A private parking charge is generally connected with the terms and conditions of parking on private land. A council PCN is part of a different enforcement system. The government consultation explicitly says the proposed private parking code does not cover on-street parking on public highways or land managed by local authorities under civil enforcement. So don't mix the two systems together. A 10-minute rule discussed in relation to private parking does not magically cancel a council PCN. A council's enforcement power does not automatically give a private parking company the same authority. And a letter from a private company is not the same thing as a penalty charge notice issued by a local authority. That distinction alone could prevent a lot of confusion. Now let's return to cameras, because this is where drivers need to change their habits immediately. If you regularly drive through a school zone, pedestrian zone, bus lane, restricted street, or other controlled area, start looking for the signs before you look for a parking space. The government already recognizes camera enforcement for certain parking and moving traffic contraventions, and councils across England are using technology in increasingly targeted ways. Solihull, for example, has been introducing camera enforcement at specific locations for moving traffic restrictions during 2026. And in Brighton and Hove, new enforcement powers were being used for school street schemes, with cameras planned for restrictions around schools. The important point is not that every road suddenly has a camera. It doesn't. The important point is that you should no longer assume that a road without a visible officer is a road without enforcement. That mindset is outdated. Now think about electric vehicle charging bays. If you drive an EV, or if you sometimes use charging bays, check the individual car parks terms carefully. A charging bay may have additional conditions about who can park there, whether charging must actually take place, how long the vehicle can remain, and what happens after charging ends. And if you drive a petrol or diesel vehicle, never assume a charging bay is simply another empty parking space, because nobody is using it. The exact enforcement mechanism depends on the site, but private operators and local authorities can impose specific parking restrictions where the signs and legal framework support them. So before leaving your car, read the sign. It sounds ridiculously simple, but that 30-second habit can be worth far more than the few minutes you save by ignoring it. And then there is engine idling. This is another area where headlines can make the situation sound more universal than it actually is. Local authorities have powers relating to unnecessary engine idling in certain circumstances, and some councils actively enforce these rules, particularly around sensitive locations such as schools. But the exact power, penalty, and enforcement approach can depend on the local authority and the applicable regulations. So if you're sitting outside a school with the engine running while waiting for someone, don't assume that because you've only stopped for a few minutes, you are automatically safe. If you don't need the engine running, switch it off. This isn't just about avoiding a fine. It also removes any argument about whether the idling was necessary. And now we come to what I think is the most useful part of this entire update. Your parking defense should start before you ever receive the ticket. Take 10 seconds when you arrive. Look at the entrance sign. Look at the road markings. Look for time restrictions. Check whether you're in a permit area. Check whether there is a school street. Check whether the bay is reserved for a specific class of vehicle. And if you're using a private car park, take a quick photograph of the main terms if anything looks unclear. You don't need to become a parking lawyer. You simply need to create evidence. Because imagine Joan receives a parking charge 3 weeks after visiting a supermarket. She remembers paying, but she doesn't remember exactly where she parked. The sign she saw has disappeared or been replaced. She has no photograph, she has no receipt, and now she's trying to reconstruct what happened from memory. Compare that with Joan taking one photograph when she arrived. The sign, the bay, the payment machine, the time. Suddenly she has something concrete. That is the difference. And this is why the phrase I want you to remember is very simple. Don't pay first and investigate later. Investigate first. Read the notice. Identify who issued it. Check the date and location. Look at the alleged contravention. Read the appeal instructions. Gather evidence. Then decide what to do. If it is a council PCN, use the formal challenge or representations process explained on the notice and the relevant council or government guidance. If it is a private parking charge, use the operator's stated appeal process and check which accredited trade association or appeals service applies. And if you're dealing with something complicated, particularly where court proceedings are involved, consider getting independent legal or motoring advice rather than relying on a social media post. Now let's return to the biggest change, because this is the part that affects everyday drivers most directly: pavement parking. The government's 2026 legislation means more local transport authorities will have powers to enforce dangerous pavement parking, including through penalty charge notices. But the rollout is not a single switch that makes every pavement in England automatically subject to an identical national ban overnight. That means your action is simple. Check your own council, not your friend's council, not a Facebook post from another county. Your council. Look for pavement parking restrictions, traffic regulation orders, local consultation notices, and enforcement announcements. If new restrictions are introduced on your street, pay attention to the signs and dates. And if you've been parking partly on the pavement for years because the road is narrow, don't wait for the first ticket to find out whether the rules have changed locally. Move the habit before the fine arrives. Because the purpose of the new powers is specifically to allow local authorities to deal with pavement obstruction where they consider it necessary, with accessibility for wheelchair users, blind and partially sighted people, and parents with pushchairs among the reasons given by government. So this isn't just a story about fines. It is a story about enforcement becoming more local, more camera-based, and more dependent on the exact restriction applying where you are. And that brings us to the final lesson. There is no single magic number that tells you whether every parking ticket in Britain is legal. There is no universal new £50 rule that you can use to throw away every private parking notice. There is no universal rule saying every pavement in England is now automatically banned. And there is no guarantee that a camera means you have done something wrong. The details matter, the location matters, the signs matter, the date matters, the type of notice matters, and your evidence matters. So, before you drive away today, remember this. Pavement parking enforcement is expanding through new local powers. School streets are increasingly using ANPR cameras to enforce timed restrictions. Private parking regulation is being strengthened, but the government's new statutory code is still a developing process rather than something you should misrepresent as already fully operational. Grace period and charge cap proposals exist, but you must check which rules actually apply to your ticket. Dropped curbs and restricted areas remain places where careless parking can create enforcement problems. And cameras mean you can receive a penalty even when you never see an officer. If you know someone who regularly drives to collect grandchildren from school, parks outside their home, uses supermarket car parks, or relies on the same routes every day, send them this video. The most useful thing they can do is check their local restrictions before the first notice arrives. And subscribe if you want these kinds of changes explained before they become an expensive surprise, rather than after you've already paid. Because in 2026, the smartest parking habit isn't simply knowing where you can park. It's knowing which rule applies before you leave the car. I'm Cal, and I'll see you in the next one.